The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, author and Harvard political scientist Danielle Allen tells a tragic story of how the war on drugs has abandoned the people it's supposed to protect. Kenneth Andrews of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill answers this question about social protest in the era of Trump. Can it lead to long-term change? And Bill Press talks with Carolyn Fiddler of Daily Kos about all the wins that Democrats are racking up around the country. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Danielle Allen is the director of the Edmond J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University. She was awarded a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant in 2001. In her most recent book, Cuz, The Life and Times of Michael A., she tells the story of her cousin, a young man who was tried as an adult at age 15 for attempted carjacking. After 13 years in prison, he was released and died violently at the age of 29. It is a story, she says, about the deep and destructive war on drugs that has corrupted a criminal justice system that has abandoned our nation's youth. And we say hello to Danielle Allen, Harvard professor and MacArthur Foundation genius who has published broadly in democratic theory, political sociology, and the history of political thought. She's also the author of a new book, Cuz, The Life and Times of Michael A. Danielle Allen, thank you so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
Always nice to speak with you. Was the set of circumstances that led to your cousin's incarceration at 15 and eventual murder at 29 mostly a result of police misconduct, a racist legal system, or just public revulsion at street crime?
So I think it's a number of things coming together. So I think we have to see that individual responsibility, family responsibility, and social responsibility all operate simultaneously. And the way I like to think about this is by invoking the idea of a degree of difficulty. So young people coming up in urban city centers that have been afflicted by the war on drugs and by racialized policing face a degree of difficulty that's completely different from what young people coming up in suburbs face. Kids make bad decisions in both contexts. Michael made bad decisions. The consequences of his bad decisions were much higher for him than for a kid coming up in another place. His family, the rest of his family, we did not see the things that Michael was struggling with, and so in our failure to see, we didn't help him in a timely fashion, in a way that could have helped him get onto a better course. So I think it's really all three of these things coming together, the individual, the family, and our collective responsibility to provide fair opportunity structures for all young people.
Now, aside from the individual unfairness visited upon your cousin, what does the entire law enforcement and prison system do to the entire community?
So I'm going to take the question in a slightly different direction because I want to spend a little time talking about the war on drugs, because I think as a society we have underestimated its negative impact on us. So I think that the war on drugs, the way we have criminalized marijuana, criminalized other drugs, and then built an entire penal system around that, has had deep consequences that we don't fully appreciate. So if you don't mind, I'd just like to go through a few of them for a moment.
I think that would be great.
So we all recognize that 14% of people in prisons currently are there for nonviolent drug offenses. Okay, so that's one huge chunk of our prison population. And you have to think that all of those people are people who have been taken out of their families. They're not working, not providing for their families. They're not working with their kids on their kids' education. So that's a huge impact in the first instance. The second piece of this is that all of the drug crimes have swollen the workload for prosecutors. They have insufficient bandwidth to deal with, for example, homicide. Homicide rates in this country have clearance rates, that is, the rates at which cases are closed, have fallen precipitously from the mid-20th century. So in the middle of the 20th century, they were about 90% everywhere. 90% of cases were closed. We're down now to clearance rates in major cities of around 50% quite consistently. When you have that kind of drop in clearance rates, you don't just get like a little more violence in cities, you get a phase shift upward in the level of violence. So then you have a world where there's just more violence in all of our cities across the board, precisely because we've actually changed the focus of our criminal justice system from the stuff that really matters to the stuff that doesn't matter so much. And then in the context of that violence, you have young people coming up who have to figure out how to navigate a violent world. They need protection. Who's offering them protection? Only gangs. And then they get caught in that, and the cycle continues. And so it gets worse and worse. But there's another issue, too, which just goes to the moral character of this country. So most Americans don't know that drug use is equal opportunity. Everybody's participating. Drug sales are also equal opportunity. Every group is represented as a drug seller. And Americans spend $100 billion a year on illegal narcotics. That is a huge amount of deception, hypocrisy, lies, secrecy. I believe that just basic kind of corruption of our moral character is also distorting of our social fabric. And then let me just put one other thing on the table, which is this. You have to recognize that once you criminalize drugs, you're distorting the entire penal system. So when you've got punishments of 6 months to a year on the books for simple use and possession of marijuana, and 1 year to 5 years for simple use and possession of things like cocaine and heroin, your entire penal system has to shift to longer sentences just to make sense of the fact that you have sentences that long for just simple use and possession, where the only person being heard is the person using. And, then when the whole system shifts that long, that's another reason why we have so many people in prison. It's partly because our sentences have gotten so much longer. So we still have not come to grips with the many dimensions in which the war on drugs has fundamentally corrupted the legal and social fabric of our country. And I really believe that is the single most important thing we need to tackle if we want to restore health to our urban communities, to our rural communities, and across the board.
And then add on top of that the opioid crisis, which there's a strong argument that if you do the simple thing of just legalizing marijuana, you could potentially at least abate the opioid crisis significantly. And then in turn, of course, you're keeping people out of prison. So
that's right. Exactly. And it's also worth noticing, not many people have noticed, but the demographic group in the country that has seen the biggest increase in rates of incarceration in the last 10 years is white women. And that's directly connected to the opioid crisis. So the fact that we treat drugs, drug use, and so forth as a criminal matter rather than a health matter is a travesty, sort of violation of what would be best for human beings in general. Mm-hmm. So I think being able to transition from a criminal justice approach to drug control to a health approach to drug control is just the single most important thing we could do to improve health and well-being in this country.
We're speaking with Danielle Allen, Harvard professor, and talking a little bit about her new book, Cuz, The Life and Times of Michael A. And Danielle, something that's pretty shocking to me is America has 4% of the world's population and 22% of the world's prisoners.
Yep.
The simple question is, how did we get there? But I think you just addressed it. I mean, that's it. The crux of the matter is that's how we got there.
That is how we got there.
Yeah. So how do we convince people in today's world, those that are in power and making our laws, that somehow still don't seem to get it, and for the next 4 years it might even be worse? How do we change the thought process?
So, Jim, my training originally is as a historian, and the very first book I wrote was on punishment in ancient Athens. And so that means I have thought about punishment over time and around the globe. And so the point you make is so important. The world has never seen a penal system like the one we've built. We have surpassed what South Africa created. We have surpassed what Russia created. And we have to own it. We Americans did this. We've made the biggest, most powerful penal system the world has ever seen. We have to take responsibility for that and undo it. And I believe the way we can get politicians to change on this is if we, the people, express ourselves on this point. And again, this is a place where I think it's really important to pay attention to state politics. State legislators can do a lot to change the dynamic on this. And so I just really urge everybody to start paying attention to who's running for their for office in their states. There's a lot of people who run unopposed at the state level. There is huge opportunity for reform at the state level if all those of us who have clarity about the fact that we've built this prison system that we need to unbuild could get ourselves organized, pass this message along, share this message with our representatives, make sure that the people running for office understand this message. I think it's on us, the citizens, to drive that message home to politicians.
Politically speaking, Danielle, is it possible to actually put some blame on liberal Democrats like the Clintons, Joe Biden, for making tough on crime rhetoric acceptable to middle of the road voters?
You know, the truth of the matter is I think we're all to blame. Yes, they absolutely contributed. There's no question about it. And African-American communities contributed too. There's great books by Michael Fortner and James Foreman that go into how it is that African Americans contributed to sort of tough on crime strategies and approaches. So I think at the end of the day, we got going on this war on drugs in the 1970s without any deep understanding of its implications. And so I think there was lots of kind of well-intentioned action with unintended consequences that everybody participated in through the 70s and the 80s. And so now, though we have to, despite the fact that everybody contributed, we all need to look at it straightforwardly and plainly and figure out how we can all contribute to unbuilding this thing we've built.
Obviously, and we've addressed it some in the past, African Americans want public safety just as much as anybody else. But for some reason, law and order is the only thing they get from politicians, and even some black politicians. Why?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think this is a very good and hard question, and I think this does go to the issue of why is it that our response to problems in the black community is a purely punitive response. So why is it that we have trouble understanding how to create opportunity in the black community? I'm certain that the racial history of this country has an impact there, that we are simply less good at understanding how to create opportunity in the context of African American communities. But that is plainly what we need to do. And so from my point of view, it's sort of a blessing that we are now able to see as a health question the problems that are arising through the opioid crisis. And my hope is that we can take what we're learning about the opioid crisis and apply it more broadly and see the way in which, if we think about the health and well-being of all kinds of different communities that are implicated in the problem of drugs, we should be able to build positive opportunity structures that provide health, access to health, structures that provide access to other economic opportunities outside of the drug economy and so forth. So it's clear that we need, a multi-pronged approach to the problem. It cannot be limited to a sort of law and order approach.
And these are the alternatives to prison that end up keeping communities safe.
Exactly, yes. But there's also, just different approaches to juvenile justice, different approaches to punishment. Generally, there are good examples of restorative justice approaches in Australia and Germany, for example, where people who have offended will be in a halfway house. They're able to leave during the day and go work and thereby develop their skills, develop their capacity to contribute productively to society. They have to return to the halfway house in the evening. But the contrast is, in this country, we're warehousing people in facilities where their capacities to contribute productively just wither, atrophy. And so then we are surprised that the reentry issue is as complicated and as difficult as it is. But of course it is, because we have not been giving people time during the period of their sort of paying their dues to society to build productively, to develop and be ready for that moment of reentry. So we really also need to rebuild the rehabilitative element of our prison system.
Okay. Danielle Allen, Harvard professor, author of the new book, "'Cause: The Life and Times of Michael A., joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org. Danielle, as always, it was a pleasure speaking with you today, and we do look forward to having you back again soon.
Thank you so much, Jim.
You're quite welcome. Thank you. You as well. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Kenneth Andrews of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill is a protest scholar. He describes an extraordinary year of protest against the Trump agenda, but says it remains to be seen if it translates into real change. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Language matters. For example, the words that corporate and government officials use to report on the health of America's economy can either make clear to us commoners what's going on, or hide and even lie about the reality we face. Consider the most common measurement used by officials and the media to tell us whether our economy is zooming or sputtering: Wall Street's index of stock prices. The media literally spews out the Dow Jones average of stock prices every hour, as though everyone is waiting breathlessly for that update. But wait, nearly all stock is owned by the richest 10% of Americans. So the Dow Jones average says nothing about the economic condition of the 90% majority of Americans. For us, and for the true economic health of America as a whole, we need to know the Doug Jones average. How are Doug and Dolores doing? Well, as we've seen, stock prices keep rising to new highs, while wages and living standards of the middle class and poor majority have been held down by the same corporate and political leaders telling us to keep our eye on the Dow. To disguise this decline, they play another dirty language trick on us when they issue the monthly unemployment report. Currently, with the unemployment rate down to 4%, they tell us America's job market is booming. But wait again. That only reflects the number of jobs, not the dollar value of those jobs in terms of wages and benefits. Having lots of people doing poorly paid work is hardly a healthy job market. Notice that they don't measure the stock market by the number of stocks out there, but by their value. And they should measure our job market the same way in order to give an honest picture of how Doug and Dolores are doing. This is Jim Hightower saying, of course, they'd only do that if they gave a damn about all of us Dougs and Doloreses. And that speaks volumes about their bias for stock-owning elites.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. 500,000 protesters are expected to show up in Washington, D.C. later this month. Even more will join them in sister marches across the country. Led by students from Parkland, Florida, their goal is to change the nation's gun laws. Protest historian Kenneth Andrews says it takes more than hitting the streets to create long-term change. And we say hello to Kenneth Andrews, professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and the author of Freedom is a Constant Struggle, the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement and Its Legacy, and also of a New York Times essay on how protest works. Kenneth Andrews, thanks so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And, well, it's our pleasure to have you with us. There was a huge worldwide outpouring of protest the day after Donald Trump was inaugurated. How much have we seen since then, and is it enough to make a difference?
Sure, those are great questions. So the Women's March was really an extraordinary event. It's one of the largest days of protest in U.S. history. So you had hundreds of events around the country, in all parts of the country, with an estimated 4 million participants. And if you look at sort of what's happened since then, certainly we haven't seen the same levels of activity or number of events on any one day. At the same time, it's been really remarkable in terms of a very high level of protests compared to any sort of comparable period. Looking, for example, other modern presidents have faced protests during their first years in office. Of course, probably everyone remembers Obama, some of the protests that Obama faced with the tax day protests and so on, but nothing on the scale of what we've seen this past year with, I think you could even argue that this protest has been the defining feature of the first year of Trump's presidency. Everything from the Muslim travel ban, the Day Without Women, March for Science, town hall protests as members of Congress come back to their districts, over 350 events around the Charlottesville incident. So even things like that, where it wasn't really necessarily about national politics or about Trump, were sort of flamed and escalated through his commenting on those protests. So all in all, it's been a pretty striking year for those of us who study and are trying to make sense of protests with a lot of diversity of issues and targets and so forth. Now, your second question was, is it enough? That's a challenging one to gauge. I would say that you can see some possible indications that the protest is having an impact already, that it may be making it more difficult for the Trump administration to pursue some of its goals, maybe making it harder for Republicans to get unified, and it probably has helped Democrats stay more unified on some of the kind of key policy issues. It hasn't stopped certainly all of the kinds of things, or achieved all of the kinds of goals that activists might have been after, but has certainly been an important force in the kind of political dynamics of the past year. And of course, the longer range question, I suspect we'll get into about sort of, can the protest be sustained, and, how is it going to sort of translate into longer range organizing? I think those are things that we'll be trying to figure out as this continues to unfold.
Well, and here's something else. What's the likelihood, whether or not there are constant protests, that Trump's outrages become normalized by making the previous ones less appalling in comparison?
Yeah, that certainly could be the case. It may go the other direction as well, right? That there is a real that there both, I think, among activists, to a certain degree among the media, that sort of paying attention to and sort of tracking these has become sort of part of the back and forth of contemporary politics, and so that there's a kind of heightened scrutiny and awareness, and people are really trying to stay on top of this and even anticipate what the next outrage will be. It could still, even with that, with the sort of people on the front lines really staying on top of it, it could still fuel some sense of alienation from politics, sort of a disgust for the political system. I think in terms of this issue about normalizing it, the longer range issue is really going to be sort of what lessons do other politicians take from this? Do they try to go out and sort of emulate Trump's style or substantive politics? And when they do so, are they able to sort of be successful in doing so, or do they sort of fail to win elections or sort of rally people around that kind of style of politics? And so I think that'll be sort of a longer range question, whether this is something that sort of becomes closely associated with him, or whether it sort of really changes the kind of norms of democratic politics as some people are worried about.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's look back at a previous era. I think it's easy to say that mass protest helped achieve civil rights and an end to the Vietnam War, but did it really, or was it more of nuts and bolts political organizing, or did in fact one lead to the other?
So I think it's always a combination, especially when we think of these really sort of large-scale social movements, that there's both important dynamics in the movement of protest and organizing. There's also important things happening in the broader society. But protest was absolutely critical for fueling those movements. If we sort of go back to the civil rights movement, and the real sort of waves of protest that we associate with that movement started in 1960. When the Kennedy came into office in 1960, he had little interest in pursuing a civil rights agenda. It was nowhere near the top of his concerns. But it was really the wave of mass protest starting in 1960 and then really sustained over a number of years that really compelled politicians who may have been sympathetic but just didn't see the urgency of the issue to take it seriously, because the protests really disrupted businesses. It put the United States in a difficult position on the global stage by sort of showing a contradiction between our rhetoric and our commitment to democracy and then discrimination at home. And so the protests really pushed the issue in a way that many decades of organizing had not really been as effective. But organizing was certainly critical too. It was on the backs of a lot of organizing that protest was able to get off the ground. And then civil rights organizers came around afterwards and sort of took a lot of the energy, the new activists who came to and got involved through protest, and helped channel that into sort of a longer lasting kind of social movement.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're speaking with Kenneth Andrews, professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In addition to being the author of the book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement and Its Legacy, he's also the author of a New York Times essay on how protest works. From a culture standpoint, if culture is important in social movements, which side is winning now? Is it the values voters or the millennials who seem to have no problem with marriage equality and bathrooms for everybody?
So I think it partly depends what we mean by winning. I think in terms of popular culture and public opinion, a lot of the attitudinal changes that you're pointing to there do sort of move in the direction of marriage equality, whereas sort of younger people are become more open to these ideas. That it is sort of moving in that way. On the other hand, we do have some issues like, say, abortion or guns, where it's not so clear, where the long-term trend over the past few decades, say, on abortion attitudes, has been largely stable. And so despite, sort of liberalization on some other dimensions, that might really reflect the kind of success of the Christian right and of the pro-life movement, and at least sort of holding the line on a small minority position, but in really sort of keeping that intact in terms of a group that's very vocal and unified in its opposition. So the larger trend may favor some of these moves that you described with the millennials, but there are some more complexities there. I think the other important cultural trend for social movements and politics more generally is around polarization. And so so we may see some broader changes, but we also have to keep an eye on the ways in which our attitudes are really, people are talking to people who share attitudes like themselves, and really sort of not interacting as much with people who have views that might differ from their own.
I think that might scare me the most, actually. That people just do not engage in conversation because I'm not going to have a conversation with somebody that doesn't agree with me, and that's not healthy for anybody.
Absolutely.
You do give credit to the Occupy Wall Street movement, and even though it was so loosely organized, and on the surface anyway, it didn't really change much, but what did that movement do, at least in terms of framing issues?
Well, so I think it did interject this idea of inequality into a lot of the discourse in society. And so in the mainstream media, we saw a real uptick in a lot of discussion of inequality and people trying to figure out what was going on there. Even another study looked at this in terms of, what did politicians start talking about inequality? And in fact, Obama started talking about it much more extensively, as did other members of Congress after the Occupy movement. For example, by talking about the idea that everyone should have to pay their fair share. At the same time, some of the movement's message, I think, got diluted there, in that the more sort of harder edge that the movement, in its sort of singling out Wall Street and corporate greed, didn't get picked up as much as the movement's ideas sort of filtered out into the broader society. So I think that sort of picture of partially being able to get the message out is what happened in that case.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your state of North Carolina, the notorious bathroom bill, even though it was modified, has hurt the state's economy. Are boycotts effective ways of promoting change, or only when corporations join in?
So they can be effective, absolutely. Boycotts of a state are fairly unusual. So I think prior to North Carolina, there was a bill in Indiana around that was going to allow businesses to decline service based on their religious beliefs to certain kinds of clients, customers. The more typical kinds of boycotts focus on corporations as their target. Regardless of whether I think a boycott is targeting a state or a corporation, one of the big things is whether it can really sort of damage the kind of reputation of the target, whether the company, or in this case the state, is facing constant media coverage and sort of public outcry about its policies. And so I think that's part of what happened in North Carolina, that you both had the NBA, the NCAA coming out saying they weren't going to hold tournaments in the state. You also had celebrities who were bringing this negative attention, and all of that sort of fed, again, sort of this increasing scrutiny of the state and putting it in this sort of negative light. And so there are lots of boycotts these days. It's easy to call one on social media, and so a lot of those fizzle out, and because consumers may not actually sort of follow through. But when they do, when those boycotts are able to really sort of bring a lot of kind of negative attention to their target, they can really put a lot of pressure in a way.
Mm-hmm. Kenneth Andrews, professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, author of Freedom is a Constant Struggle, the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement and its Legacy, and this great New York Times essay on how protest works, is our guest today on americasdemocrats.org. Kenneth, we do appreciate your time with us today, and we look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you very much.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks Blue Wave with Carolyn Fiddler of Daily Kos.
Carolyn Fiddler joins us from Vox News, Daily Vox, I'm sorry, my God.
Daily Kos.
Daily Kos. You changed jobs so much.
Who am I? Why am I here?
I ask myself that every minute of every day.
Yes, right.
A reporter once had me this week as representing the State House Action Project, which is definitely what I'm going to name my 501c4, but not who I actually work for.
It's good to see you.
It's great to see you. It's been a while.
We understand that you had a few metro problems this morning. By the way, it's
crazy out there.
Crazy. I've never felt the wind like walking over here this morning. I mean, I don't know what's going on.
Stingjet. Did you hear that's what the term is? Stingjet. That's what Capitol Weather Gang called it. The Washington, D.C. area is getting to 70 miles per hour today. And they're called Stingjets because they're just like gusts. They're not like sustained winds like a hurricane or something like that. They just come out of nowhere. I mean, the house was last night, right? The house was rocking. Driving in this morning, the car was sort of skittering.
Schools are closed today?
Schools are closed today.
Federal government.
Federal government's closed today. It's cuckoo bananas out there.
Well, it is. And they were canceling flights yesterday in anticipation of bad weather today.
It's bonkers.
I wouldn't want to be flying today.
Hell no.
Yeah, right.
Especially not that short runway at National.
Oh, yeah. No, exactly.
But again, like one of the things that they were saying is like these winds, they just kind of come out of nowhere. I mean, they knew they were coming, but like you can't really, it's not like a buildup. It's just all of a sudden just a whoosh.
But I've never seen this before. The airlines were actually saying, we'll give you, you cancel, we'll give you money back or we'll put you on another flight. I mean, they were in anticipation.
Damn.
Of what's happening. So we're glad you made it.
I am.
But
I'm
also,
happy I'm here.
the MARC trains between here and Baltimore are canceled today.
VRE as well.
Wow.
Virginia Rail?
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember that happening before. Are they afraid that trains will blow over or what?
Except for anything but like snow, yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I would guess so because again, like the statement that they put out from our friends of the Capitol Weather Gang at the Washington Post, they put out a statement. They were just like, if you don't have to be anywhere today, do not go. This is like not a joke. They're not trying to be overly cautious. So, I mean, naturally, I'm here. There was nowhere else I'd rather be.
Right, exactly.
And you'll have to forgive me. My hair is a little windswept today, and that's really the biggest problem.
I don't even want to think about mine, y'all.
Okay, well, goodbye. I'm going home.
Exactly.
Carolyn, how are you?
I'm great.
Let's talk about races. So I've lost count. The last time I checked, it was like 35 or 36 state legislative seats that Democrats have been able to flip from really red districts not just close, that Donald Trump carried by double digits since he became president. What's the number now?
Right now we're at 39 after this past Tuesday.
Get out. Wow.
Yeah.
That is incredible.
It's amazing.
What's going on?
Well,
is this the blue wave?
I'm hesitant to call it that quite yet. I came up in Virginia politics as a Democrat back before it was cool to be a Democrat in Virginia, so I'm kind of a pessimist. But with 80 state legislative elections that have happened so far, there are a lot of data points to look at, and even the seats where Democrats aren't flipping these seats from red to blue, they're still doing better. They're overperforming the Democratic presidential performance in those districts, also by double digits most of the time. But Democrats keep flipping these seats, and at 39, that's a really good it's a happy set of data for Democrats to have and to look at as we move into November.
So there have been 80, right? Mm-hmm. And roughly Democrats have flipped half of them, roughly.
Right, and the majority
others,
of them have been open Republican seats.
Yeah.
Because they've been elected to other offices or they get appointed, like the congressional seats that have become open, they get appointed because the Republicans assume these seats are safe.
Right.
So they appoint Republicans from these seats and plan to fill them with more Republicans. It just hasn't always been working out. Yeah.
Well, we haven't looked at that closely, and I'm glad you mentioned it, is that in the ones where Democrats have not won, they still have increased their performance, if you will, substantially.
Drastically,
right?
Yes.
Okay. So I forget what 37 was. You said there were two this week, 38 and 39. Where were they?
New Hampshire House and Connecticut House.
New Hampshire.
We've flipped 5 seats in the New Hampshire House this cycle.
Wow. Right. And Connecticut.
Connecticut was a seat that had been held by Republicans for 44 years.
Yeah.
And we flipped it.
So what is the count now, if you know, of state legislatures, Republican or Democrat? I mean, this is the one where under 8 years under Barack Obama, we lost 900 and some seats. Right.
So
we got still a long way to go.
We do.
But with redistricting coming up, that's why this is one of the reasons why this is so important.
It's true. It's true. After November, Democrats were able to helpfully add 2 more Democratic trifectas to our column in Washington State when we picked up the state Senate there, and in New Jersey when we flipped the governorship. Unfortunately, redistricting is not controlled by the legislature in Washington, and New Jersey is an interesting process. It's not really controlled by the legislature there either, so that doesn't really help for redistricting, unfortunately. But a lot of seats are up this fall that will have direct impact on redistricting. Places like the Colorado State Senate, Democrats are only down 1 seat. We can flip that. Minnesota State House, and we need to keep that governorship this fall. Places like the Florida State Senate, it's a long shot, but we thought Virginia was a long shot too, so nothing's really off the table.
Yeah, and Virginia came so close.
I know.
Right.
One film canister, really.
One film, yeah.
Oh, God.
One slip pulled out of a hat, right?
Oh, my God. It was bananas.
Yeah.
It's out of a bowl.
Ain't politics grand?
Oh, stop.
Like, this is how we make decisions in the year of our Lord, 2018.
Film canisters out of a bowl.
Yeah.
So what has made the difference in these special elections? I mean, how did Democrats win 39? I guess it was a combination of things, but
it
first,
often is.
Having a candidate run in every one of those. I mean, that's people say, well, of course there'd be a candidate run. That's not necessarily the case. There have been times when either party did not put up a candidate in certain districts. They just gave up.
In North Carolina, for instance, filing is done there, and Democrats have for the first time probably ever. Democrats are running candidates in all 170 legislative districts, 120 House districts, and 50 Senate districts. Democrats have candidates in all of them for the first time, probably literally ever, and we're seeing that in other places too. In Ohio, Democrats have candidates in all those seats. Democratic recruitment is going really well in Arizona. It was amazing in Texas. And as more and more filing deadlines close, we're going to see more and more of this, I think.
Yeah.
But having a candidate run is very important. And there's one thing that Democrats have now that like just money can't buy, that Republicans just don't have. And we have just energized voters. Our electorate is really amped up to get out there and cast a ballot in ways that we haven't seen in a very long time, and in ways that Republicans are definitely lagging in. So
the energy and the momentum is definitely on the Democratic side.
Yes.
And there's been a lot of they must have also, another element obviously is raising enough money to have a serious put forth a serious campaign.
True.
And grassroots activity.
Yes, and those things have been
organizing, basic organizing,
and that's been happening in these state legislative races as well. I know that the LCC, the committee that elects Democrats to state legislatures, their fundraising has been going really well, and candidate fundraising, no worries, has been very, very strong for Democrats in these races, and volunteerism. The volunteer activity has been just through the roof. Field programs have been fully staffed. Doors are getting knocked on. Calls are getting made. It's remarkable, and it's the kind of thing that we need to see and continue.
You know, I attended a session, a great session at George Washington University yesterday. Several political panels, and on one of them there were 3 former members of Congress, and they were talking about campaign reform, and a couple of interesting things. First one is the question was asked of each of them, knowing what you know today and the way the system is today, with how much money candidates have to raise and how much time they have to spend on the phone raising money, and the way the system is kind of broken today and nothing's happening in Congress, would you, if you were starting out today, young person, would you run again for Congress? Every one of them said no, which I thought was pretty depressing.
It is depressing.
Yeah. But the other thing that was interesting, and a Republican mentioned this, and then the other Democrats really agreed, that they said, you know what? We don't know why we spend all this money on TV ads, because they are worthless. That the ads really don't convince anybody. That so many of them, they're the consultants who they start out and say, well, of course, you've got to spend X gazillion on TV because that's how we win elections these days. And of course, the consultants get 15%. They get paid for making the ads. Then they get paid for placing the ads on television. That's their big bucks.
Plus, they can help their friends out,
Right.
like
But
who they sell them to.
But each of these candidates said what really made the difference was organizing, going out, meeting people, and serving the district. And that's if you do more of that and don't even have the TV ads, every one of them said they thought that was a winning formula. But I think you probably need a combination of both.
Right.
But I thought it was very interesting. Again, it was emphasizing the importance of grassroots organizing, which too many people have gotten away from. Obviously, Democrats are getting back. Okay, so we're up to 39. That's great. Keep going in these state legislative districts. Meanwhile, a congressional race coming up in Pennsylvania.
Very exciting.
Yeah, tell us about that one. It's coming up soon, right?
Right. It's 2 weeks from this Tuesday, I believe. Connor Lamb is running in the 18th congressional district in Pennsylvania to replace Tim Murphy, who had to resign after it came out that he asked his mistress to have an abortion because
That'll do it.
Understand.
That's a little embarrassing.
Right.
That'll do it.
Oh my gosh. What do people even think? But anyway, so they opened the seat up when he resigned in disgrace, and Connor Lamb is running a very strong campaign in what is a Republican
Against
district.
Saccone, right? What's this?
Saccone or
Okay. So did it. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Go
no,
find it.
it's spelled Saccone. I might be getting the pronunciation
Okay.
wrong. But anyway, the Republican is a member of the state legislature. Notorious conservative, a known quantity in that area because of his presence in the legislature.
And it's a seat that was drawn for Republicans. Yes, right.
And of course, it'll be a different district when hopefully when Lamb runs for re-election in November because
Right.
of the maps up there, which is a whole other ball of wax. But Connor Lamb is within striking distance in a Republican district.
That's remarkable.
It's really remarkable.
And he's got money. He's raising money. He's bringing in like some serious cash.
Oh, Daily Coast did our part. We endorsed him.
Hell yeah.
But he has to run now in the special, right? And then run in November again?
That's correct.
So, wow.
That's a quick turnaround.
I mean, a lot of these special
good
elections
news
that are
is-
happening now, it's the same thing.
Yeah. The good news is you don't really have to reset anything. You've already got a staff in place to run, right?
Yeah, you just got to keep going.
Yeah.
And Donald Trump has endorsed in this? Yeah?
Oh, yeah. He was.
I think he's been there once.
He's been there
hasn't he?
once. He was going to go there again either this past week or the week before, but he decided not to. I think in the wake of the Florida shooting,
right.
perhaps. But I
think I read
think
the
he'll
day
be there
that
again.
He's supposedly there next week,
Yeah,
or the
he'll definitely
10th
be
or
there
something.
again.
Right. So this would be a big pickup.
Yes,
right?
it'd be huge. It's the kind of flip that would make congressional Republicans' knees quake, and they're already looking at these state legislative elections and getting nervous. But losing a seat like this on the congressional level would strike a whole new level of fear into them.
Right. Especially in Pennsylvania, where with reapportionment, the Republican plan being thrown out, the Supreme Court or the judges will come up with their own plan, which really does tilt Democratic. This would be this would be a good start, right?
It tilts more Democratic than the old map. The map actually draws more districts that Trump carried than Hillary Clinton carried. So it's just it's a more fair map. I think it's a fair map, but it's definitely not a pro-democratic map.
This is one of those things that I think is different than one of the early battles that Democrats figured that they had to win was to win that John Ossoff race, right, in Georgia.
Yeah, right.
Which was a long shot, and I don't want to say it was a pipe dream because it could have happened.
No, but it was definitely a long shot. It was a Republican district.
It was definitely a long shot. Whereas this Connor Lamb seat or this Connor Lamb race, these are the types of seats that Democrats are just going to have to win. They're just going to have to win. They have to.
And so things are looking good there. Overall, for the midterms, we're into the midterms now. This is 2018.
Filing deadlines have started to close in places, yeah.
Right. Okay. And what do you see the prospects for Democrats getting the House back, and what are going to be the key issues? Just about a minute and a half left.
Oh, I think that I am cautiously optimistic. It's certainly going to be it's going to be an uphill slog.
Still,
yes, gerrymandering is still going to impact Democrats on the congressional level a great deal, but everything is on our side. The voter energy is on our side. The issues are on our side. Whether it's the economy or at this point gun safety, things like that. Democrats are on the right side of everything that people care about right now.
Do you think that gun safety will be a major issue in this 20? I mean, I would hope.
But it's forever from now, and people have a tendency to forget these things because they happen so often. So.
Yeah, Congress certainly forgot about it this week.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Trump may have had his meeting down at the White House, but nothing happened on Capitol Hill. Nothing.
And he changed his mind again.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. I mentioned, I was telling Peter earlier, Joe Scarborough has an op-ed in the Washington Post this morning with the headline, "You're afraid of not afraid of the NRA? Prove it." You know, so we saw that big meeting with Donald Trump,
right.
But what are we actually seeing in terms of a White House proposal, a White House position paper, right, or anything?
Nothing.
Donald Trump supporting specific legislation to do anything that the NRA would not approve of? Nothing. Right. So I would hope that Democrats make that a major issue in 2018. I think they will. And I think it'll make the difference in a lot of races.
I think it will, too.
Yeah. Great to see you, Carolyn. Thanks so much for coming in.
I'm so happy I could be here.
Carolyn Fiddler on Daily Kos, okay? And it's Daily Kos, K-O-S, dailykos.com.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Danielle Allen, Kenneth Andrews, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.